you you have a very interesting story, your background. So for people who may not be familiar with yourself, if you want to just kind of do like a introduction, and just tell the world about yourself a little bit.
Yeah. So my name is Will Spencer. I'm the host of the Will Spencer podcast. It used to be called The Renaissance of Men. I'm on Substack, willspencerpod.substack.com. I have a pretty varied and diverse background. I grew up in a Jewish family, spent 20 years in the New Age before coming to Christ. I've been through the world of masculine personal development, the manosphere, and found my way into the world of Reformed theology, which is fantastic. And I enjoy having worldview conversations with sort of big thinkers who help us understand the way the world is going right now. So that's some of the things I do with my content. And I'm also a men's counselor by trade. So I'm setting that business back up again, a biblical men's counselor. Very, very exciting. It's work that I love to do. So that's a little bit about me.
Excellent. And actually, I'm assuming as a biblical men's counselor, you dive into different clients who talk about their childhood experience quite a bit. I've noticed, and I don't know if you agree with me or not, but I've noticed not necessarily just men, but just kind of in general. I watch a lot of YouTube content, and I happen to watch content about people giving their testimony coming to Christ, and it it's like without fail. If it's like a long form, they're allowed to go like an hour plus. They start from their childhood. Every single one of them comes from some sort of family separation, whether it's single parenthood or they were children of divorce, every single one of them. And it could be where, when they were a kid, their grandparents or their parents took them to church every Sunday. Family separation happens, and from there, they question Christ. Um, and it's much of the same thing for me. My my relationship with Christ was altered with all the different things that was going on in my life as a kid, taking me decades to come back to Christ. So I don't know if that's something that you've seen.
Yeah, I mean, I was a freshman in college in 1996, and I remember in the freshman dorms, we're all like 18 years old, right? And so
Mhm.
we're all just sitting around talking, a big group of us, and I think we realized at the time, and this was coming up on 30 years ago, that at least 50% of the people in the room came from divorced families, right?
Mm.
And that was 30 years ago, right? So now I can't even begin to imagine how much worse it's gotten. And I was fortunate that my parents were married up until I went to college, and they got divorced the second half of my freshman year. But it wasn't by any means, it was not a happy marriage at all for all kinds of reasons. And I think the devastation to the family has been just massive, incalculable devastation to the
Yeah.
family in America and in the West. And I don't think we fully understand it yet, but you're absolutely correct that it very much is a thing.
Yeah. I Part of me, maybe it's just the optimist in me, but part of me wonders if, we're now in the information age, right? And there's all different types of information that's out there. Um, and some of it's good and some of it's bad. But I think with having a plethora of information, it allows people to kind of question things and seek things out, right? Whereas for a long time, maybe the only information or the only worldview you truly understood was basically your families and maybe your neighbors, right? And if you grow up in a community that is dysfunctional, then all you know is dysfunction. And then on top of that, it's kind of like if your family's dysfunctional, but it becomes normal to you, but you don't realize how dysfunctional it is until you see a family that's not dysfunctional. And it's like,
Right.
oh, that sounds nice. you
Well, and
know?
it sounds unbelievable is what it sounds like.
Yeah, it sounds unbelievable. So I guess my optimism comes into play. The world has opened up for so many people, and we'll just go to Gen Z. The world has opened up to Gen Z in even a bigger way than someone like myself who remembers like the early internet days. Um, we have high-speed internet, social media, a lot of information, a lot of voices, a lot of deep thinkers that are out there. But it also just like a lot of critical thinking that does exist out there. And I think more and more people are realizing that, like how you mentioned 30 years ago, you're seeing the divorce rates are high. You're seeing a lot of people reacting like, wait a minute, this was my circumstance and so many other people's circumstance, and clearly something is wrong. And I think that's like I mean, you can't change what you don't acknowledge. So that's like the first step is you acknowledge that your situation is messed up, and that's how you can change it. But if everyone is dysfunctional around you, then no one questions the dysfunction. It's just normal. So we never acknowledge that piece. So I'm wondering if the internet age is like the first, I'm sorry, let's say the information age. The information age is the first time in recent history where people are finally like looking in the mirror, looking at how they were raised, and wanting to at least make some sort of change for their kids.
That's an interesting question because um, I can see a couple different reactions to the internet age in that regard. So the first that I would say is I think that there are a lot of people that are turning to the internet that are trying to make marriage work as a rational calculation. And the
Mhm.
problem is, a good marriage is not a rational calculation because it's not transactional. Well, right,
Right.
because you have the whole MGTOW movement where it's like, why would I marry a woman who is actively incentivized in many ways to divorce me and take half my stuff? And there are guys who say that on the internet. And if, as you begin looking into the divorce industry and what's happened to men across the country for years, for
Mhm.
20 or 30 years, if not more, parental alienation. A lot of men look at marriage and they see it in many ways quite rightly as a gigantic risk. And it's hard to argue with them. It's really hard. It's not a good rational calculation. By the same token, you look at women who are like, well, why should I get married to a man and have a child and do all that when I can live a perfectly happy single life and have attention and boyfriends and all this different stuff when I can just have a free life and not be saddled with a child. And then you have couples also who get married who are like, we're never going to have kids. We're going to have our dual income, no kids lifestyle. And so you see all of that being presented
Yeah.
on the internet and really pumped up and shown to people, and they're like, oh wow, yeah, these ideas, they're kind of, I can swipe and I can have a hookup and get all the emotional connection that I want, and I can avoid the real burden of a family and responsibility for men and for women in a different way. And let's just be irresponsible forever. The problem is that line of thinking runs out of gas somewhere around age 40 or 50. Like it's older, slightly older for men, for women than it is for women. But the recognition of just how empty a self serving life is, it becomes very empty. And for every Andrew Tate or whoever who says you should live as a king, like, I'm really sorry to tell you, but you're going to grow old. You're going to grow old and you're going to lose a step and you're not going to be young, fit, and awesome. I don't care how much TRT you take. And you'll look back on your 70 years of life and you'll be alone and it will not be fun, men and women.
Mhm.
And so that's the reality of that path versus the alternative, which is to actually marry and die to self, die to yourself as a man and die to yourself as a woman, and recognize their marriage is not a rational calculation at all. It's not transactional, it's devotional. And that
Mhm.
requires such an enormous sacrifice for both men and women that our culture does not know how to make. We do not know how to think in terms of long term self sacrificial. It's me, it's my dopamine, it's my goals, it's my objectives. It's not, I'm going to die to myself to create something larger than myself. And so I think that is a barrier that lives in men and women in very different ways, that has to be overcome, that no amount of information can be overcome. It's like, the only thing that will work is you realize you reach the end of yourself. I am at the end of myself and I can go no further. There must be
Mhm.
something beyond me. And the only thing beyond me is God. And that's a whole different conversation and a good one.
That's very that's a very good point. Something beyond yourself, and the word for me as well, and you mentioned is sacrifice. And I think that's the key to any good relationship, um, is the willingness to sacrifice. And I think the relationships that fail is that at least one person within that relationship is unwilling to sacrifice.
Yep.
Um, and you can say that, with my son, raising a kid, there's certain things that you might want to do, but those things aren't beneficial for your child. And so you must sacrifice for the benefit of your child. And it is rewarding to do that. And I think we don't talk about that. It is rewarding. It's like when people do charity, they feel a sense like I did something good, like it was rewarding. I sacrificed my time and I cared for someone else that I don't even know, and I feel good. There's something rewarding about sacrificing, for someone else. Same thing in a marriage. There are certain things that I might want to do that my wife doesn't want to do, and vice versa, and we sacrifice for each other because we love each other, right? So we both have a willingness to sacrifice, and we respect each other. So our marriage works pretty well. Um, and you mentioned God. The worshiping God as a relationship with Jesus Christ is a sacrifice as well, because there are things that you may want to do that are sinful or seem fun, right? But you know the right way to go, and it's a sacrifice to keep that relationship. And it's a good sacrifice. And I think we frame sacrifice as being something that is negative, and it's actually a positive, especially when it's you giving up something that ultimately is short-term rewarding. So, um, if you want to be debaucherous like an Andrew Tate, and go and sleep with as many women, it sounds fun in the short term, but in the long term, it's empty. There's nothing good that will ultimately come from it. And those people will move on, and you'll get older, and you'll be left alone. And your unwillingness to sacrifice, years ago, will ultimately catch up to you.
Yeah, and that's actually part of my story. Before I came to Christ, I was quite promiscuous, and I can
Mm,
think back to many times. Or, of course, it's all consensual and we're all having a good time, but there were so many instances, so many moments where it's like there's more happening here beneath the surface, and I know it, and nothing's being said, but I can feel it. But like we can pretend this isn't going on, and I can do everything I can to pretend this isn't happening, and yet it's still happening. And then it ends, even if it ends quote unquote well. I look back on it years later from my saved, redeemed, forgiven perspective, and I'm like, how devastating, how awful. I'm ashamed of myself. Really, I'm sad. I wish I could go back and fix these things. And so it's actually worse. It is empty, but it's actually worse than empty because it's a lie. It's a
mm,
lie. And and I don't know what to do about that, but to give thanks to God for delivering me for that, and repent and make restitution where I can, or where I feel called. That's the lie of promiscuity, and the lie goes primarily one way. Is that like I don't think that women are truly there just for good times and for kicks. Yes, of course, there's the girls who I'm going to sleep with 100 guys today or whatever, like that whole thing, right? So set that aside. I don't think that if on Tinder or whatever, Bumble, Hinge, whatever, I don't think that the women are primarily there just for hookups and kicks. I think they're actually looking to be loved. And there are men that are not looking to be loved. And an emotional bond forms with intercourse. And
mhm.
everyone can pretend that it's not supposed to be there, and yet it is. And so at the end of it, when it ends, you have the devastation of what we call a breakup. And then the breakup is just like, it's just pain. It's just massive amounts of pain. So I think people end up worse off than they were before. So worse than empty, you're actually net negative, and you can't live life that way.
Yeah, and actually, I'm reminded of a conversation I had with a friend of mine. Her name is Inez Stepman. She's a writer, and we were at a dinner party, and she brought up. She's like, people talk about um, divorce and how like I don't want to get married because then we get divorced and we have to split our stuff. She's like, but if you think about it, like look at all the people who don't get married, who move in with each other and build a life together, and then they split up. They're like, it's essentially the same thing.
That's
Like
right.
emotionally and even physically, the only thing is like the legality is the only thing that's different, but you're still going through the emotional turmoil. You're with someone for 2 3 years, and then all of a sudden you built this life together, and then things start falling apart, and then you separate, and you got to figure out, how do I move forward? Where do I live? Maybe you had kids with them, but you just weren't married. Where are the kids going to live? Like it's the same thing, and we fool ourselves into thinking that, oh no, this is completely different, it's a completely foreign thing. And I think in that aspect, like we want to think that the only way for us to be emotionally involved is only if we stand at the altar and get married, right?
Hmm.
It's like,
Yeah.
no, the like you mentioned, you have sex with someone, and God knows how many situations I've seen where, no, we're just friends, it's friends with benefits, she's perfectly cool with it. I've personally seen a friend of mine who is like, oh, this girl at work, she's promiscuous. She's always going through guys. He's like, this is perfect. I don't want any attachments. You know what happened? She went crazy, fell in love with this guy, and was all over. And I was like, what'd you think was going to happen? You thought you were going to get the thing, and it's not going to happen. Um, Emotions get wrapped up even with just casual sex, and
Mhm.
I think we often try to fool ourselves to think that we can have our cake and eat it too, and we can just have this empty sex. And to be honest with you, like I don't like empty sex. Like it sounds terrible to me. I've never been that person. It's always been like uh, relationships, uh, or someone I had sex with just before I'm about to enter a relationship with them. But I gotta like them. There's gonna be some sort of emotional connection.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, and that's the way of the world. That's just the way it is. And in major cities now, for sure, probably a lot of smaller cities as well, where it's just like the you lead with your sexuality. So you
Mm,
take your sexuality and you put, and both parties put that out on the table first, whether it be on the first date or the third date or whatever. You go longer than 3 dates, and it's like, what are you? Some sort of weirdo, right? So
right.
you take this most precious, sacred part of you, and you give that to the other person first, and then everything else follows after. But that's no firm foundation to build a relationship on. That has nothing to do
Right.
with values. It has nothing to do with goals. It has nothing to do with actual personality, like who you are, like deep down, right? Like independently, like your values, your morals, your habits. None of that stuff. All that stuff it's thrown into the caboose after the rush of hormones, and after the rush of bonding chemicals and the excitement, and then but that high that wears off after 3 4 5 months, and then like the couple, this was the constant pattern in cities. Two people would get together, they'd be together for like 3 months, and they'd be over the moon on the most powerful drug on earth, which is quote falling in love, right?
Mhm.
They'd be high on that for 3 months, and then inevitably the high would wear off, and they would have their first fight, and then you would see whether there was actually any bond there. And many cases there weren't, but sometimes there were, and they would carry forward, and then there's 6 months or something like that. And like the couples that stayed together were the ones that just made it through the most fights, because that they stuck
Mhm.
through it enough to find out what their values were and to kind of knit their lives together. But by that point, the initial thrill of love, of falling in love, is way gone. And so what people would then do is then they would have a wedding to try and get another big rush of the big hit. And maybe it would work or maybe not, but like it wouldn't last very long, and it's completely backwards. It's
Yeah.
completely back, or they wouldn't get married at all. And so, we started the conversation talking about the wreckage of modern marriages, and I just think that this way of being has been the case since the 1960s. since sexual liberation. That's what it was when sex was liberated from the confines of marriage. That's what that was. And so when you liberate sex from the confines of marriage and you have it just sprayed everywhere all over culture now, naturally marriages are not going to have any firm foundations beyond feeling. And so people go hunting the next rush. Divorce, single motherhood, constant boyfriends, broken-hearted men living alone, in apartments, longing to be with their family. And that's why we are where we are today, because we lead with sex everywhere. And it's literally everywhere.
You know, and I completely agree with you. My wife and I will be was Judas says, hold hands and bump heads, don't let go of hands. Did it for 65 years. There you go.
Yeah.
Uh, my wife and I, we've been married now, was it 3 years? 3 years now?
Congratulations.
Or thank you. But we've been together for 5. And how we got together was I knew her brother, and we just started. We had a conversation at his house. We carried over the conversation, but like I wasn't trying to pick her up. Like we were just talking. Matter of fact, she doesn't believe me when I tell her this, but I was trying to get back together with my ex when we first were talking, but I was just talking to her like, hey, oh, she wanted to travel, and we were just having conversation. And in between that time, obviously my ex didn't work out, and her and I were just talking like friends, and we talked for weeks. And she was some months prior, she was getting out of a very long-term relationship with her ex, and we were just talking. Like I wasn't foreseeing us being any relationship, but we were becoming friends, and I liked her as my friend. And I got to know her. She would open up, and we would have we talked about literally everything except for sex. She'd tell me about her childhood, what she's going through. She might cry. I tell her what I was going through. We laugh at stuff. We would talk from 8. There were times where we talked from like 8 p.m. to 2 in the morning to 4 in the morning. And we were just like, and it wasn't the post-sex love, I can't wait to see you kind of thing. It was like, I like this person. I want to talk to her. And and so when we were like, hey, you want to hang out? That's basically how it like, oh yeah, let's get some sushi. And she lived, I was in New Jersey, she was in New York. So she was like,
Oh,
2.5 hours away from me. I'm sorry to hear that, Judith. But she was like 2.5 hours away from me. So it wasn't like it was kind of like we had to plan this out. Oh, why don't you come down to New Jersey? Let's go out. And then from there, like us going out to have sushi turned into like, let's go to a movie afterwards. And then it just turned into like an impromptu date. And we've been together ever since. So I mentioned this to say, like, due to circumstance, we never ran into that. Like, we didn't find each other on a dating app, went out on a couple good dates, had sex, things get complicated, trying to figure things out. Do I even like this person? Like, I liked her. We invested a lot of time talking to each other. So I tell her all the time, like, you're my friend. And so because you're my friend, I take my friendship seriously. Like, I would never do this thing to you because you're my friend. You're not just my wife, you're my friend. And so, like, when you hear the guys like, "Oh, I gotta go out with the wife," I'm like, I love hanging out with my wife. Like, when we're talking
yeah.
about we go out of the country every year. That's our thing we're trying to do. And I'm like, I can't wait to go out with my wife. We're gonna travel together for 2 weeks. Like, that's my friend. Why wouldn't I want to travel with my friend? So I think by establishing a friendship and not leading with sex and all this other stuff, I actually got to know her and like her. And then when we got into a relationship, then it was like, let me just see her character. Is it different when we're in a relationship? And it's the same.
Mhm.
And we got, I wrote about not too long ago our first argument because I had been in a relationship before with my ex who could never apologize and would hold a grudge for like
Mhm.
days. And I'm like, I want to resolve it. Let's resolve it. can we resolve it so we can move on and be happy again? And she's like, everything's fine. She was just passive aggressive for like 2, 3 days and ruin an entire weekend.
Yeah.
So with her, she finally would like if we had an issue, she was like, listen, and then she would tell me how she felt, and then I wouldn't say anything, and then I would say how I felt, and she would hear me, and then she might apologize or I might apologize, and we're good. Why? Because I'm not trying to fight with my friend. I'm trying to resolve an issue with my friend. So I think I think that's really important, that friendship element. I used to think like it was, oh, I married my best friend. I used to think it was like a corny line. And sometimes I think people are exaggerating, but I do think that there are people who genuinely feel like that's my friend. Like we talk about everything, we do everything together. I love hanging out with my friend, and I understand it now.
Hmm. Make me think of a quote by the playwright Oscar Wilde. He said, everything is about sex except for sex, which is about power. Now,
Hmm.
Oscar Wilde was a degenerate, right? Talented writer, but a degenerate. And I think what you were experiencing was that you were in a relationship where it wasn't about power. It was about actually the relationship. And it was no one trying to get power over the other person. It was actually a real, genuine bond. Passive aggressiveness, all of that, it's just about power. And that's a really sick and it's overused, but toxic dynamic that people fall into all too easily, where, maybe one person has to be the person in control, or like, they fight for power and it's lots of sparks and friction, and that's not how it's supposed to be. That's not how it's supposed to be in any relationship. And that's the unique blessing of Christian relationships, is that they're not actually about power, not in the way that
Hmm.
we understand them, because both parties are under authority. And if you find yourself inside yourself wanting to assert power over somebody, unrighteous authority over somebody, you're in sin and you're accountable for that. And it's the only way. I think it's the only way forward for relationships. Now, Christian relationships also have a hierarchy to them, which is anathema to our culture. That's a longer conversation. But the hierarchy of relationships should not be subject to power in the way that I'm talking about. But if you step
Right.
out of that framework and you go into the world, worldly relationships are all about power, usually inverted power relationships as well. And everyone's felt that. And we're not supposed to feel it. We're not supposed to feel it in Christian relationships or out of them, but it's the order of the day outside of them for sure. And you can't build a relationship that way. All you can do is build a truce, right? Or you can build some sort of thing where someone gives over their whole self to be controlled. And in that environment, you can't be friends. You can't have an authentic relationship. You can't be
Yeah.
yourself. And it's very much what it's about. Quiet, in many cases, quietly.
Yeah. You got me thinking, to kind of go back a little bit. You mentioned the MGTOW guys.
Yeah.
Um, I got into the manosphere content during the pandemic. It was when I started like watching some of it. And actually, um, I don't know if this sounds weird at all, but when Kevin Samuels kicked off,
Oh,
my
love Kevin Samuels.
my wife and I would watch, and she'd be like, "Wait, hold on a second," and then we would pause and we would talk for like an hour and a half. Like we just have this whole dialogue going back and forth, and she would say her piece, I'd say my piece. We were never like fighting or anything like that,
Yeah.
but we were. I was like, I sort of agree with them, and I understand. And she was like, but what about this? And we were just. She really got to understand so much so that like by the time he passed away, it was like Saturdays. I think it was usually like Saturdays. Would be like the I think he would do it like on Friday nights. And Saturdays, my wife was like, "Yeah, put on Kevin Samuels,"
Yeah.
and then we'd watch, and we really actually bonded over that.
Yeah.
Um, and listen, it's not to say that I agree with everything that he said, but he was he was at least mature in
Yeah.
how he was approaching it, and he was very straightforward.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the reaction to him being very straightforward with people, like just cut to the chase and get to the point, showed me that there's a level of unappreciation for how men are very direct.
Mm-hmm.
And we've almost trained men at times, especially in certain environments, to beat around the bush because being direct is seen as too abrasive when actually being direct and honest with someone, like if you care about someone, you're honest with them and you're direct with them. You
Yeah.
don't you like that's a good thing. um but we're told to not do something that is good. And so if you it's like the trope of, do I look fat in this? Right? And so if my wife says, Adam, do you think this looks good? Like I said,
Right.
right? That's oh no, you're not supposed to say it. Yeah, you're supposed to say you look great in everything. Why would I lie to my wife? Like that's not love. Like you be direct, you be honest. You don't say like you look horrible, but you can say like, no, I don't think that's for you.
Right.
I like this other thing better, right? That's so I think we're telling men to not be direct, and by not being direct, which is our natural way of communicating, we're also telling men to lie about who we are and how we communicate effectively, saying that there's something wrong with being direct and communicating in that particular way. And one thing, credit to Kevin Samuels for always saying this. He says, this is a men's podcast. He has always said that. This is a men's podcast, and I am always speaking to men, and men speak directly.
Mm-hmm.
So if you don't like it, don't call in. But this is a men's podcast.
Right.
So I think there's I think for some of those women who would call in many cases they didn't grow up in a household where men were like that, or there were no men who had like in a position of authority within their home, that they could respect. Because it was always interesting. The ones who would call in and who were receptive to it would sometimes say like, "Oh yeah, he's you speak like my uncle does, or you speak like my dad does." Like they would say stuff like that, and that's familiar to them. It's the women that were it's completely alien to them that really rejected it and saw him as like the worst possible figure. Meanwhile, everyone else is like, "This is normal." You're actually abnormal for not recognizing it.
That's right. I'm so glad you brought up Kevin Samuels. I was talking about him with a friend of mine. I miss him. That he might have been the best of the manosphere that
Yeah,
ever was, and it gone too soon for sure. What's interesting
yeah.
about Kevin Samuels was that yes, he was very direct, and he was also unflappable. Like you just couldn't get to that dude, and he had spent years doing it. Like he was an overnight sensation, but he had been at it for like 10 years or something like that. So he had earned his way up to that place. But he was well put together, sharp suit, tie, glasses, nice background, and he was just in his spot. And what was so strange about it, it's like the women would call in and they knew who he was. Like you heard the show before, right? And the thing was, it was that they thought that they could beat him.
Hmm.
The one of the big advantages that women have over men is that women are generally more verbal than men are. They think quickly on their feet and they respond very quickly, and women are generally have that advantage over men. They did not have that advantage over Kevin Samuels. He could think as fast or faster than, in fact, he could probably think faster than most of the women because he could see the direction it was going. And they were
Right.
just so used to running circles around the men in their lives that the men would be 5 steps behind. What when the women's run on, and she's like, I don't need to listen to you. And Kevin was right there with all of them, and they finally found somebody who wasn't going to take their excuses, who wasn't going to take their treatment of him. In fact, the greatest thing that he came up with, and I still think about this, is he had documented the language patterns that they would use against him to
Hmm.
try and break him down. Remember sign language,
Yeah.
right? Shame, insults, guilt, and the need to be right. And so anytime he would get into a conflict with one of these women who they called him to fight with him. They didn't call him to listen. They called to engage in combat, right? And they found someone who's better. So they would start out by shaming him. right? That was always the first and the strongest weapon. Talking about his mama or all this different stuff, trying to shame him. He's like, that's S. And then they would insult him, like, you're stupid, all that stuff. And he's like, I, you know, and then guilt,
Mhm.
like, you kiss your, you know, you say this stuff and you're a terrible person. You know, that's the next one. And then they would just get N, which is the need to be right, where they wouldn't give when he had finally defeated them, and then they'd bounce out. And that pattern, it would run it the whole time. And once you see it, you start to understand that, like, this is the way, again, talking about power, this is the way that women can attempt to exert power over men. And men who are immune to those patterns, who can let the shame kind of bounce off them, the insults and the guilt that need to be right, they find themselves in a very rare position for men today. And that's not to say that men don't exert power over women. Of course they do. But we're very used to recognizing men's power, physical power over women. We're not used to recognizing women's emotional power over men. And so the women who had called in to Kevin Samuels, who I'm sure was a perfectly kind guy, he just did not play that game. And it was very powerful to look at that taking place. And he was just very, very good at it. And that's
Yeah.
why, and again, he was unflappable. And I wish that more women had listened to what he had to say instead of trying to defeat him, which I don't think any of them ever actually did. It was very instructive.
Yeah. I think you know, I'm one of those people who thinks that you can learn something, especially from successful people. You can learn a lot from people, even if you don't initially agree with them.
Yeah.
Um, I've years ago, not so much these days, but years ago, I would watch The View. Um, my ex-girlfriend, she would have it on, and I would sit there and watch it. And it was a political, it was political discussion, and you got to hear these sometimes a viewpoint that is, supposed to be a female viewpoint. It's like, okay, let's hear what these women have to say. So I would watch it, not to say like I became a fan and wanted to sit in the audience, but I would watch it and I would consume the media just like I would consume all different types of media. And I think I think there needs to be a healthy appetite with consuming things that challenge how we see the world sometimes.
Yeah.
Um, and obviously, like there are things that are outright ridiculous, right? So we, but you have to watch it to realize this is ridiculous. Like this is too much. Like I've consumed a lot of manosphere content. Some of it I agree with, some of it I do not agree with. Some of it I realize is just entertainment, right? Where some other people might look at what I see as entertainment as being deadly serious, and that's how they live their lives, which, you know, is sad in my opinion. But I also realize like some of the content is just rage bait. It's just doom and gloom. And of course you can find a new celebrity who's going through a split or a divorce to highlight so you have new content that you can run with for this week. And then the next week there's another story, or you can go into the Daily Mail and pull out this story. Yes, if you look hard enough, you will find it. Like, and you will see, guys. See, I told you, women are this, women are that. See, I told you guys. And what I think is a disservice. See, the thing that Kevin Samuels was originally doing was telling men how to improve themselves and being extremely direct with them,
Mm-hmm.
and was saying, I think one of his lines was like, "Pick a struggle." you know, he's like, "You can't be overweight and broke. You like you got to pick one or the other."
Yeah. Fair.
so so like the male improvement end, I think, has diminished since his passing, and it's
Mm-hmm.
become men's entertainment at the expense of ridiculous women.
Yep.
Um, and the and especially nowadays, the online prostitute is the modern woman. And so let's debate the online prostitute to prove some point when actually the online prostitute actually wins at the end because she gets your she gets your audience to become subscribers on her OnlyFans and she makes a ton of money. That's
Yeah.
why they're there. So which tells me they're not actually helping men. right? They're giving them a short-term release to yell at the whore, right? And then later on, they're going to masturbate while watching the whore. Like, what kind of weird circle environment are we actually breeding? So I've seen that shift from wanting to help and improve or advocate for men when it's necessary to just wanting to entertain them at the expense of women, and the worst type or the most ridiculous, or what the caricature of what they talk about. Um, and it does them no good, and it doesn't help their audience. It makes them feel good in the short term, but it just keeps them in the same place. um, I wish there was more content that was pro marriage, but it talked about it in a way that was realistic, because I also don't like just get married, just get married. It's like, well, why should you get married, and how do you select the right person? Like, this is very important, how to approach this. Instead, they tell them, just get your money up and just throw it out there, and they get disappointed when they lead with money, and then the women take the money and leave them behind, and they're not interested in them.
That's right.
So yeah.
No, you're right. The manosphere. There was a moment in time where the manosphere was very focused on men's self improvement, right? So you had legions of men that found their way into the manosphere and the red pill because they had been in a relationship where they thought things were going well. They were a nice guy and they loved their girlfriend, and then they find that their girlfriend left them for a more macho masculine guy who ultimately maybe he used them and discarded them or whatever. But like you
Hmm.
know, like it's the classic. She goes chasing after the high school football guy or whatever, and so you had all these broken-hearted men who were like, what happened? And so then they discover what's called the red pill. The red pill uh, awakens them to human sexual dynamics, the sexual marketplace, all this different stuff. It was a big awakening for men. Okay, so then what happens after a man takes the red pill? And I don't mean like the Matrix, like the red pill in terms of like politics. I mean in sexual dynamics, hidden knowledge about what men and women find attractive in each other. And so they take the red pill. And so the response to the red pill, it would go in a couple different directions. One is it would go into bitterness. It could go into bitterness very quickly. Like, I've been lied
Yeah.
to about everything. Everything is a lie. I hate everyone and everything. I hate women. I hate this, blah, blah, blah. And it would be corrosive to men. Now, and that was a real thing. There was a minute though where the manosphere, in a spirit of, we might call it brotherly love, not Christian brotherly love, but certainly men caring for each other, would swoop in and say, "Hey, brother, I understand. Here's a set of weights, and here's a protein shake, and here's a way to make more money and to start showing up, and you start putting yourself together so that you're a better man, so that you don't actually create that draw towards the man who appears to be better. These macho, masculine, confident guys, they're not actually better, but they appear like they are for a minute, versus
Hmm.
men that are generally more nice guys. And so the manosphere would come in to lift these nice guys up to turn them into the men that they could be. I think it was ultimately a very noble thing. It was godless, but I think it was ultimately a very noble thing because we've lost what that means. The problem was you had COVID come in, and COVID came in and it created all of this political awakening, right? Where you had all of these guys who looked, and now the lies are so much bigger, and it just made everyone so much more angry and more upset and more lost. And there was no picture of like, how do we get out of this? And that's the black pill. And then when you really do take the
Hmm.
black pill, what happens is you fall into the trap of believing everything is about power and you're hopeless and you're helpless, and then you just become nihilistic. And that's the ditch that a lot of men fell into. The only way out of that, the only way out of that is not the white pill. It's not being naive about the way the future, like it's all going to work out somehow, cross my fingers. The only way out of that was, they called it the Christ pill, Christianity. That was the only off ramp, right? But the off ramp into Christianity, it asks something of you. It asks you to repent of your bitterness. It asks you to repent of your sins. It asks you to humble yourself before God for the first time in your life. And that was too big of an ask not for a lot of everyday men. It was too much of an ask for a lot of the men who were leaders in the manosphere. And so they looked at that and they bounced right off. And they just went into that black pill nihilistic direction. And they took a whole bunch of guys with them. And that's Andrew Tate. Andrew Tate was the guy who was the best at all of that. Now, there are a
Mm,
lot of men, myself included, who made it out of that world because ultimately they realized it was spiritually impoverished. But like, it's not a path that everyone could walk. And that's the moment that we kind of find ourselves in, is a lot of people are waking up to, they've reached the end of themselves, and they're seeing the potential in Christianity because now it's having a moment in the public sphere, and praise God for that. But as they go walking in that direction, do they begin discovering, like, no, this is actually going to ask something of me that's quite uncomfortable and humbling and humiliating? And will first of all, will men have the strength to do that? And then the other bigger question is, will women have the strength to do that as well? But that is the only way forward. And it's still unclear which direction we're going to go. But you identify a very real phenomenon. I saw all this on the ground firsthand, by the way. This was my life for years. So I can tell you, I watched it, like watching it at ground zero of all this take place, 2020, 21, 22, and then 23.
yeah. And now we're at a point where I almost feel like we're back at a point where we're almost behind from where we started.
Mhm.
Um, because now, when we are trying to advocate for men in some realistic way, um, it gets mixed and molded into the Andrew Tates,
Yeah.
right? Because the phrase "a dead clock is right twice a day" comes to mind when I speak of Andrew Tate, because yeah, he can say the most obvious thing in the world, and just because he says something a couple times that are true, right? And I think most people will agree is true, does not mean the man knows what he is talking about everything or is giving good advice on everything. Um, and so there are two dynamics that I find absolutely fascinating. So with Andrew Tate, so you have these guys who are like, let's say they're lower on the totem pole as far as or they're lower in the sexual marketplace, these guys, and they're struggling, and they're tuning into this content, and they're like, oh, these chads are taking all the women. So what do? They say they hate the Chad. The Chads are taking all the women. I'll never be a Chad. So then what do? They go and listen to the Chad, Andrew Tate.
Yeah.
It's just like, wait a minute. I thought that's the guy that you hated. So now you were complaining about him, but now you're following him. And you're trying to become him. But then why did you hate him in the first place? It's very confusing to me to see that shift. And then the other part was, you have all these guys say feminists. Oh, all these feminists. The feminists are the problem. There are all these career-minded feminists. They don't want to get married. They don't want to do this stuff. So who do they listen to? Pearl. I
Sure.
mean, Pearl exemplifies a feminist, but she swears to herself that she's not one. She owns her own business. She tells men what to do. Like, she is argumentative. She's dramatic. Like, we can just go down the list of tropes about feminists, and Pearl is exactly that. Um, and so you have these men who are following a feminist while complaining about feminism. It is so bizarre to watch in so many different ways. And it makes me think to myself, these guys were lost and were trying to be found and had some sort of hope, and they're listening to the absolute worst people they could possibly listen to. And now they're even in a worse situation before, because now they're just angry, resentful, and just want to be entertained, and their life is getting worse. I was watching this video, and it was some live stream. He was a younger guy, youngish guy, maybe his mid 20s, and he's talking. He's doing like a live stream, trying to get advice from this, one of those big alpha guys, right? Um, who has very little life experience himself, but he thinks because he's jacked, and yes, I'm an alpha. I know what I'm doing.
I have abs.
And
Listen to
but
me.
yeah, exactly. Um, but the what really stuck out to me was this younger guy said, I go to the strip club all the time and I throw away hundreds of dollars each time. And I thought, like, wait, we got young guys in strip clubs throwing away money? Like, obviously, we've heard of old guys in strip clubs and, rappers in strip clubs. But I didn't know, like, 25-year-olds are going, like, semi-daily to the strip club, throwing hundreds of dollars away. And I was like, these men are really lost. And then they go and talk to this guy. And his best advice you could tell him is to get in the gym. Not to, hone down to like, well, what's causing you to do this? Because it sounds like you need some sort of help, like something deeper than go and lift some weights. Lifting weights can help, but like what are you looking for? What are you searching for? And that's why I like listening to you, because you have depth. You're saying, I know you're being promiscuous and I know you want these things, but why do you want those things? And I think that's the thing that changed for me, was realizing um, I wanted validation from women. And so that's why I was doing these things. And so that's why I had an air of desperation at one point in my life, because it was like, please like me. It I need that validation. But when I started to actually work on myself and build my confidence, that validation disappeared. So by the time my wife came around, I wasn't desperate, or anything like that. I was comfortable with myself. And I think there are a lot of guys who just lack that confidence. They're just not comfortable.
Yeah, I relate very much to that. And I think for some of these men, that breaks my heart to hear that young men are going to strip clubs, because I look at that as they're they desperately want the affection of a woman. They want that in their lives, and they don't go to OnlyFans for it. They in some minuscule, infinitesimally small way, it's actually healthier than OnlyFans, because at least they have the strength to go confront a real physical woman, right? As opposed to doing it all mediated
Yeah.
through a screen, right?
Yeah.
And it's such a poor parasitic substitute, where they're being used, and the women are being used, and the whole thing is just ugly. And they're doing it in like the safest environment possible, where there's no risk, but just to be near it. And and the advice from the jack dude is not bad insofar as it goes, but like, it doesn't stop at the gym. Like, yeah, okay, there is something very powerful in a man's psyche about, you look at this thing on the ground and it's super heavy and you can't lift it, and then 3 weeks later you can lift it, and there's no negotiating with it. You can't negotiate with a deadlift barbell. It doesn't care about your feelings. It's either going up or it's not. And to understand that you can make physical material changes to your body, which you live in, and you can make the thing move, is powerful for a man. But it doesn't end there. And I think for
Hmm.
a lot of the masculinity influencers, they take that thing and they say, okay, you made the bar move, bar go up, great. And then you have your bank account, and then your bank account go up, great. You're now, and now you look at women, oh, body count go up, right? You're getting those numbers up. And like, that is a dead end, because when you start poking at these guys morally, when you poke at their conscience, when you poke at the facts that they lie, that they have dark secrets that trouble them, that keep them up late, right? That they end up in many cases masking a lot of things with power that is really, it's real. Like, muscles are real. There was a famous author whose name escapes me right now, Warren Farrell. Warren Farrell
Yeah.
wrote a book called The Boy Crisis. Excellent, excellent book. One of the best writers about the broken family generationally. And he and I were talking once, and he was saying that men's muscles are a mask of masculinity. It's a mask. And I had to explain to him, like, they're not actually a mask. Like these Navy SEAL guys who are super jacked, they're not wearing a mask. That's a real thing that can do a real thing. So it's not superficial, right?
Mhm.
However, like physical power can be used to mask moral compromise, and that's just true. And so if you get all the numbers up across the board, but your conscience is still broken, you're not a whole man. You're just not.
Yeah.
Now, by the same token, and this is the ditch that the Christian world falls into, if you have a clean conscience, but you're weak and you can't make progress in your life, that's not necessarily better. You're going to have a really, yes, of course, you're saved. Praise God, hallelujah. But you're not going to be able to have a life fit for service in the most maximum way possible here, right now, what you are called to do. And it's holding these two contradictory thoughts in mind at the same time that's really hard for our short attention span world. And so, my hope long term is that somehow these worlds can be reconciled where you can say, you can rightly order these loves, let's call them, like, yes, Christ is your highest goal. Absolutely, every day, your spiritual disciplines are essential. Don't compromise on them. And you're not going to be in your prayer closet all day. You do need to
Mhm.
go be able to make things move in your life. And I swear to you, if you order these things properly and you commit yourself to these disciplines, you have the possibility of having a truly fulfilling life and truly being a man that can find a wife and live that out. You can't
Right.
be either or. And that's the problem that I think they want the shortcut. They want it to be just this or that. So, you have to be able to do both. And it's an enormous ask. It's a huge ask. And I'm sorry, I don't make the rules. I just work here, right? That's how it is. And so I try to call men to that.
Yeah, and even doing those things takes time.
Yeah.
The delayed gratification element of it takes it takes a toll, and it takes time to reach to that particular point. There was one question from Kevin Briggins. He said, how can we give them a better and healthy alternative of masculinity?
Yeah.
Um, I don't know if you want to answer that.
Yeah. I mean, um, I think the best and healthiest examples of masculinity appear all throughout Scripture. You see truly great men who are themselves very flawed, except for one guy, right? And so you can like right next to each other in the Bible, you could read the Psalms of King David, and you can watch one of the great kings in all of human history pouring his guts out in poetry, pleading with God, expressing love and joy and commitment to God, confessing sin, like in Psalm 51. Like, I don't know that we spend enough time reflecting on how significant Psalm 51 is. Like, just go read that and say, like, can you imagine if someone like a Donald Trump were to write something like a Psalm 51 and have that be his legacy? I don't think we'd
Hmm.
recognize just how significant that is. And so you have that picture, right? And then right next to it, you have Solomon with this incredible amount of wisdom in Proverbs and then Ecclesiastes. And you see these men like, I've had all the pleasures, I've done all the things, many concubines, Solomon says in Ecclesiastes. And it's all vanity. And then you can read Paul and you can read Peter's redemption and Moses, and you see the spectrum of these incredible men that somehow also that do incredible things and have the strength to be truly humble and faithful. And then you have Christ, and he redeems all of them. He lifts them up for their failings, right, with his blood, and you get in that a total picture of masculinity across the whole thing. You can't just pull on any one of them. You have to look at all of them, and that is the only place that I've found that finds a really complete picture of masculinity. Now I have a book over here. This is Louis L'Amour to the Far Blue Mountains. This is, I don't know, this is my first Louis L'Amour book that I've ever read. Louis L'Amour has written dozens of books. Adventurous Men. This is about a pirate who settles, a British pirate who settles in the American frontier. I'm guessing it's in the 1700s. And this book is full of man's men. This is a man's man, right? And so it's a very moving. It's fiction, right? It's very moving to read, but it still feels incomplete because this is not a Christian man. And so I'm reading this book, being like super inspired to go cut down some trees and build a stockade and hunt in the forest, and all that stuff's awesome, we don't live in that era anymore, but still looking like where is this man's contrition and humility before God? And that's really necessary for a man to be healthy, so that he doesn't start thinking that he's the end all be all of everything, which we are liable to do. And so
Yeah.
I always point men to scripture, the totality of the thing, right, for the most complete answer. And then, of course, there are lots of other sources that you can turn to. I have Lord of the Rings there. That's another good one. But scripture is the most complete place. And if you construct everything else around it, around the Bible, you start to build out a picture of what it means to be a man. But you have to start with scripture.
You made me think about something, and uh, I just realized like one of the issues that I find with the manosphere and the depiction of masculinity, it's it's typically one dimensional.
Hmm?
Like
Yeah.
it's just uh, get women, build muscles, get money. Like it's just this one prototype of a man. There's no humility, there's no sacrifice. Matter of fact, they tell you like if she says no, dump her, move on. Just like be avoidant as possible in your relationships. Almost like be a dictator, like be your own dictator. Even when you finally do get the girl, be a dictator. Um, like it's a rigid, archaic kind of a man that is one dimensional and is doomed to fail at some point. Like there's going to be a point where that man fails or has a miserable life, which to me is still failure. And the people that I appreciate when I look at men that I either admire to some extent or I look up to, they're well rounded. Like the best ones are flawed and recognize that they're flawed. Um, and I'll name someone, for example, Dr. J. Bhattacharya.
Mhm.
Um, I've had the pleasure of interviewing him in person and also having lunch with him as well. He came out to Princeton. We actually breakfast. We had breakfast together and get to sit down with him and talk to him on like on a deeper personal level. And he is someone who he's about to get confirmed to take
Hmm.
Fauci's old job. Um, but he is someone who is not the typical guy that you would say is a real man, but he is absolutely 1000% a man. First off, in the face of risking his career and his reputation, he still said and did the right thing.
That's right.
He didn't, and I'm talking to him, he questioned himself. He went through the entire thing, but at the end, he stood resolute and he had the support of his wife and his family to stay the course. Another thing is, and something that's really big for him, he's a Christian and he recognizes his flaws and he talks about his flaws and he talks about where he could have done better and where where his blind spots were, right? So he talks about these things. And that is a level of humility that I think is incredibly I appreciate that level of humility, and I try to do much of the same thing. I talk about my flaws and things I've messed up on, right, and where I've learned and grown from. That's I think you have to have humility in order to grow. So when I look at him, he doesn't have big muscles, but he's a brilliant man. He's a dedicated father and a dedicated husband. He is someone who risked his career to do the right thing, even when overwhelmingly the people in his field were, even people he's known for decades, were trying to get him removed from his Stanford job. And he still went forward. And that, what would Christ do? That is the epitome of it, of knowing that everyone is bending to the will of what is wrong, and you still do the right thing, even though it will cost you, or it could potentially cost you. And look what happened. By staying the course, by doing the right thing and taking all those blows, he's now about to be confirmed to take Fauci's old job.
Mhm.
So it just goes to show you, like, that to me, that's a man. That's a real man, not some fictional man who needs a bunch of bullshit surrounding him to mask to mask stuff about him that he doesn't want people to see. This is a man who was vulnerable, who risked things, who sacrificed. And on top of that, he says, I needed the support of my wife,
Mhm.
right? And I needed the support of my family. And I did these things for my family as well. And I didn't know what was going to come from it, but I felt like this was the right thing to do.
That's right.
And so it's that moral element that you mentioned before. Like, you got, what are you doing this for? Right? What motivates you? Where's your moral compass? And that's why I use him. If you put up a picture of him next to Andrew Tate, they're like, oh no, Andrew Tate's the real man. Look at him, he's big and he's brash. I was like, no, the real man in this situation is the brilliant Dr. Jay Bhattacharya.
That's right. You put your finger right on it. We lack today, and I can't emphasize this enough, we lack men of moral courage, true moral courage. That is what's missing. Men who are willing to stand up and risk absolutely everything, their career, all of that, right? Particularly their reputation, their friends,
Mhm,
their family, for the truth, for what is right. And that shows up in men's lives in ways big and small. I think all throughout the day, we as men are called to take morally courageous stands, including against ourselves and the people around us. And it's very easy to pass on those situations of moral courage, and that takes a toll on us. And to see in the public square just how few men are of true moral courage, I think is a real spiritual toxin of our day. I don't know if there was ever a time where men in general were more morally courageous. I can't actually say that. But one of the things that I say frequently is that the world has never lacked for physically courageous men, for firefighters, for soldiers, for construction workers. Nothing wrong with any of those things. That takes real physical courage. I don't mean to minimize that. The world has never lacked for those men. The world
mhm,
has always lacked for morally courageous men. And the ability of one morally courageous man to shift all of history is so massively underestimated. Christ is the best example. But the example that I always give is Tank Man. You know that photo of the guy standing in front of the tanks in
mhm.
China, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah.
like here's a guy. Who knows who that guy is, right? Not particularly fit. He's a student. He's got his little briefcase. He's got his white shirt on. Looks kind of skinny. And there's one morally courageous man standing in front of a row of tanks saying no. And God knows where that guy is right now. And he, unfortunately, China probably was not very nice to him. But that single moment of moral courage, that photo will outlast all of us. It will outlast all of us as a sign of what it means to be morally courageous. And so, one morally courageous man who's willing to take a stand, and he didn't know anyone was watching. He didn't know there
Mhm,
was a photographer up in the trees or wherever it was. He just did it because it was right. And that single photo captures the feeling of what it means to be a morally courageous man. And we don't have those men anymore, particularly on the media, particularly on TV and all that stuff, because I don't think you get to the highest levels of the media without being morally compromised in some way. And so all we
yeah.
see when we turn on the TV, watch the news, or watch a movie or whatever, are men and women too who are morally compromised. Courage has gone out the window. But we don't have
Mm,
to be that. We can take morally courageous stands in our everyday life, and we're called to. The trick is doing it the right way. You have to do it with grace, and you have to do it with tact, and you have to do it with immediacy. It's a big ask, but we can learn how to do it. And learning how to take morally courageous stands shifts our entire world more than a barbell ever will. And so you can train a guy to lift a barbell, you can train a guy to make a lot of money, you can train a guy to, sleep around a lot, But to train a guy in moral courage is a completely different challenge. And that's what I would like to do, is inspire more men to those morally courageous stands in little ways so they can build up to do in bigger ways in the way that God calls them to.
Yeah, amen. I mean, I'll use my story as an example because I truly I don't see myself as being someone who's special. I just think I went down a particular path, not caring about the repercussions of it. I felt compelled to write my first book, Black Victim to Black Victor,
Hmm?
during in the post George Floyd and all this other stuff was going on and high racial tensions. And I felt compelled to write the right thing and say the thing despite it not seemingly being the popular thing to say. And I didn't know how my family was going to take it. I didn't know if my job was going to fire me. I didn't know any of that stuff. And I had conversations. She was my girlfriend at the time, but I was talking to my wife about it, and she supported me 100% with doing it. And it was a blessing that the opposite happened. I was more so embraced and supported from my family. But it was, to me, it was like it was that risk I was willing to take. And I think the primary reason I was willing to take that risk is because I've been through far worse things. I've been through so much other shit. I've lost my job before. I've been through that. I've been homeless before. I've been through that. If telling the truth and following my conscience and leading by example for my son leads me to lose my job, I'll find another job. Right. But I knew that it was the right thing to do. I felt compelled to do it. And I wasn't saved at the time. And I was coming from being agnostic, but I was at that time, I acknowledged the existence of God. I felt God was in my life. I felt like I wasn't the only one who was writing that book. And I felt like this was the moment, this was the time, and this is why I'm supposed to do it. And those other things, the risks of losing your job or being alienated by family and stuff like that, it is far worth it to lose those people temporary, let's just say, so you can do the right thing and do what you're called to do. And much in the same way with this, my latest book, I I'm not even exaggerating. I had like a revelation. You're supposed to do it now, and
Yeah, you
and
wrote
I
it
was
real
just
quick.
yeah. It took me like 3.5 months or so. Yeah, it was about 3.5 to 4 months. But I'm telling you, I was sitting on my couch and because I was trying to sell it to a publisher, had a book agent, it fell through, and I was just like, I don't even know what I wanted to do. And they wanted me to do like a memoir. I didn't want to do a memoir. And then it was just like, boom, it hit me. It was like God said, you're supposed to do this yourself. And I got up from my couch. I called my friend. I was like, "You're gonna be my editor." Okay. I was like, boom, here's what I'm doing starting tomorrow. Like I knew exactly what I needed to do. God woke me up and said, now is the time to do this. And I still feel like everything has worked out exactly how it's supposed to work out.
Mhm.
Um, and I might say some stuff in this book that makes some people upset, and I'm okay with that. I think it's least controversial than my first book, but you know, I just I'm with you. I want more people to take that risk because I think those nightmare stories of people losing their jobs and getting canceled, those are the nightmare stories for a reason because they're rare. And it's to scare people into not taking that brave step. And honestly, I don't feel that I was that brave after doing it because I was like, wait a minute, far more people agree with me. I'm actually not saying the crazy, ridiculous thing. It's just that everyone is scared to say the common sense thing. Everyone's been scared into compliancy and just shutting up. And the people who are saying the ridiculous stuff are the few, and they're just not scared to say it. So, like that's I want more people to realize that's why I advocate for people to say the thing, write more often, things like that, because that fear is not of God. like if you feel compelled to do it and you're being held back by fear, that's not God holding you back. So that's if I can just like leave with anything, I want people to become more courageous and not be so scared and not look at those nightmare stories as the likely thing to happen, but as actually the abnormal thing that could ever happen. But it's still worth the risk.
That's right. Yeah, and I think you're very right about that. And this would be something for a later conversation. But I don't know if you know, but I lived in the African American theme dorm at Stanford for 2 years, and so that was a real good
Mm,
introduction to some of the inner dynamics of the Black community. I lived there once
mhm,
because by assignment, and the second year I could have lived anywhere on campus, and I chose to live in that dorm. It was a wonderfully formative experience for me, and so I can understand how speaking into the things that you did in your first book would be like, yeah, no, my conscience convicts me. And if I could leave anyone with anything, it would be this. It would be learning how to take those morally courageous steps in the right way. There does have to be a leap of faith component to it. And the best example, I think, for how to do this comes at the end of the third Indiana Jones movie, the Last Crusade, Last Crusade. And at the end of that movie, I love this scene. Indiana Jones is navigating through all the maze, like all the different all the different puzzles, which are great. And then he comes to this big chasm, and he looks out of the chasm and he's like, how am I supposed to jump across this? Well, it's a leap of faith, is what it's supposed to be. And all he knows is that he has to take a leap of faith. And there's a diagram and stuff like that. Like you can't run and jump across it. There's no way. It's just a leap of faith. There must be a way across it. And I don't want to spoil it, but like he stands there, he closes his eyes, takes a deep breath, sticks out his foot, and takes a leap of faith. And there's a moment where he releases himself totally to that. He doesn't try to control it, he doesn't try to manage it. He just releases himself totally to the moment, and it works out. And that's how you take those morally courageous steps. And if you can give yourself that singular moment of peace to know that you have released yourself to take
mm.
that step, then everything else that comes later, you have that moment of peace that you can hang on to no matter what storm comes. I can get another job. There are lots of other ways I'll be okay. I have this peace inside myself before I take the step and start the storm. And I would imagine that carried you through some very difficult moments, knowing that you had that peace. And knowing how to do that, I think, can be very powerful for more people.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, I think we should leave it there. This has been a great conversation. Um, I knew I wasn't going to be disappointed. I'm glad you accepted my invite.
Absolutely.
Um, Abby, Abby wrote, "That's courageous, Adam. I'm so glad that you did take that step. I'm glad I did as well. You never know what's going to come from it. Like I said, I wrote the book, and I'm dead serious when I say this. Zero expectations. I just knew I was supposed to write a book, and I
That's right.
said, let me see if anybody wants to read it. And here I am today. Um, a presidential candidate has my book. I've given my book to Ron Johnson personally. You know, like what the fuck happened? Like I'm not supposed to be here. That's kind of like that's my mentality. Like, what am I doing here? Um, but you just never know. You just never know, and you take that step. And I took it in faith in God, knowing that something may come from it. I don't know what was going to come from it, but when I look back, it's just like blessing after blessing after blessing, and then putting Christian after Christian in front of me to ultimately lead me to getting baptized last year. So I
Beautiful.
mean, yeah. But thank you so much. This has been a good faith chat. Um,
Yes.
Thank you, Abby. um, No, Will, this has been a great conversation. We have to do this again in the future.
Right.
Chris Cairns is in the chat. Chris was one of the people who baptized me.
Oh, praise
Um,
God.
yeah. So thank you, Chris, and I hope you're doing well down there in Alabama. Um, yeah, but thank you so much for coming on here and talking with me. We'll do this again in the future, and obviously we're going to work together in other ways. Figure that out. we'll obviously talk about that behind the scenes. But thank you again, everyone. Thank you for tuning in. It's been a great conversation. If you're on the replay, I'm going to try and do this every Thursday, give or take 8 p.m. Eastern. And if you want to be part of the conversation, join us and subscribe to the Substack if you're watching this on YouTube. You get the updates. But yeah, this has been great. Everyone have a wonderful night. Will have a wonderful night, and we'll chat later.
Thanks, Adam. Bye,
Peace.
everyone.